To initially install the pillow block bearings, called that because we use pillow blocks to hold them up off the tabletop, and why the pillow blocks, in case we have a round sheath on the shaft of several inches to give enough clearance space underneath, so we can use a larger, say, sheath for belts or other connections or load, pruning brakes, that sort of thing for it. But initially we're going to just mount these onto this. And so we pick out the 4 holes in the table that allow us to align the shaft directly in line with where the motor is going to go. And so I pick out 2 blocks, put those over the holes, 2 other blocks, put those over the holes that roughly I plan to put the bearings onto. Now on the bearings, there's really 2 sides to a bearing. Other than the fact this is where the lubrication goes, and these are the mounting holes and the mounting plates. Inside, this is the bearing hole. Now ultimately, the shaft goes through that hole and should line up reasonably straight. In other words, perpendicular. So I hold it this direction. It should pretty much be flat across. I turn it this direction. It should be pretty much right in line with the camera. These bearings are meant to be, are basically held loosely in the holding. So they may be cocked sideways. If so, we can use the shaft to straighten that out. And I'll show you that shortly, but the first thing we need to do is to mount them in here. Now, to clamp the bearings closed over the shaft, so that the bearing rollers, the rollers of the bearings still allow the shaft to rotate, but the shaft is held in place, we use locking O-rings that will go on. And you see on there's a lock place in here, then you see a split there. On these O-rings, there are 2 set screws. Those 2 set screws go on opposite sides of that split. And that's what presses and compresses this clamp down to hold the sharing in place. But on those things, before we put any shaft in, we would normally put the ring on loosely, and we'll talk you through that later. But for right now, we're just going to put the bearing on top, lining up the holes with the table, and then for hardware, our traditional 4-inch bolt. Typically for this, 5/16 or 3/8, usually 3/8 for this. Flat washer on top. Drop that through the hole. Literally drop through. Lines up with the hole underneath the table. And then from underneath, we're going to put on turn. Flat washer, lock washer, and then nut underneath. So I'll go ahead and do that. Usually by hand tighten is enough. So my right hand is below the table while my left hand thumb is holding the top of the bolt. And I proceed to do that and about, not quite hand tight, enough to be kind of snug to keep it from rattling. See how much it rattles? That's good enough. It just holds it in place. We're going to do that for all 4 bolts. Now, since we got all 4 bolts in place, our next step is to put the shaft through the pillow bearings. Now, for that, notice this is still somewhat loose and movable. We can move this around slightly. We haven't tightened to even hand tight yet, because in order to have the shaft lined up through here, we must have it a little bit loose so we can make sure the shaft totally aligns with all these holes and pushing through. Now these, unlike your lab station, these are particularly close together. And I've made it this way deliberately. It gives me a little bit more of a problem than you will have. The further apart they are, a little bit more playroom you might have. Now a key here in putting these on is that the bearings, these O-rings, lock on the inside on both cases. So in both cases we have the set screws on the inside part, not the outside part. So you have to keep this in mind when putting the shaft in. Pick a hole and slide the shaft through. There you see it slide up. But before I put it through the second hole, I will slide on 2 of these O-rings just to hang loosely. They can spin loosely, that's fine. No problem. And now I line up with the second pillow bearing, and I push through. You can't see my right hand, but I gently push through. And it's okay to turn while I'm doing this. Usually it's a little easier. And there we go. It's finally through. Now when you have these properly lined up and tightened down, before tightening down, this bearing should be very easy to push in and out. You can see I can push it in and out. That's good because we're going to need to be able to do that with the shaft to move it. So I can put couplings in here, pull it back, drop the coupling in place, push it back in. And this assures that we're lined up so there's no side loading on these bearings. You have side loading on bearings, it adds a lot of torque that winds up in heat, harms the bearings, and doesn't get any extra work out of it, and also overloads the motor slightly. So here on my last step, I'll have a shaft in place, 2 O-rings, everything mounted here. Now the next step, we'll talk about how to level this shaft.